Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Branches of Wisdom, the Banyan Books podcast. I'm your host, Ross Makichi, and very excited that today our guest is Mr. Peter Singer, coming from Australia. Before we get to his formal introduction, letting everybody know that although we have people joining from all over the world for these live streaming events, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Most of Banyan's events and podcasts are free. We welcome your donations to keep these programs accessible for all. Just click on the PayPal link in the show description below. Also, towards the end of our conversation today, we'll be taking questions from you, the live audience. So go ahead and type those into the comments section on YouTube, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Our guest today, Peter Singer, the father of the modern animal welfare movement, was named one of the most influential people in the world by Time magazine and has been called the most influential living philosopher. Singer is the author of many books, most notably the pioneering book Animal Liberation, which was published in 1975. Singer is the founder of The Life You Can Save nonprofit, former laureate professor at the University of Melbourne, and is about to retire as professor of bioethics at Princeton University, where he's taught since 1999. Today, Peter Singer is with Banyan Books in conversation about his new book, The Buddhist and the Ethicist: Conversations on Effective Altruism, Engaged Buddhism, and How to Build a Better World. In The Buddhist and the Ethicist, Singer joins forces with the Taiwanese Buddhist monastic and social activist Shih Chao-Hwei. They talk ethics in lively conversations that cross oceans, overcome language barriers, and bridge philosophies. They share unique perspectives on contemporary issues like animal welfare, gender equality, the death penalty, sex, abortion, euthanasia, and much more. Together, these two deep thinkers explore the foundation of ethics and key Buddhist concepts and ultimately reveal how we can all move toward making the world a better place. If you'd like to learn more about our guest, his work with The Life You Can Save, as well as the Journal of Controversial Ideas, you can visit his website, which is petersinger.info. Banyan community, join me in a very warm welcome. We're really honored to have him here today, Mr. Peter Singer. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really, really honored to have you here. This kind of dialogue between you and Shih Chao-Hwei, it's really wonderful to see. I mean, you come from very different backgrounds, a Western man from the academic world in conversation with an Asian woman who's a monastic Buddhist. Very different people engaging in this very healthy, robust dialogue on quite challenging issues. I'm wondering if you can just start by telling us a bit about Chao-Hwei and what inspired you to engage in these discussions with her.
Yes, certainly. I first met Chao-Hwei many years ago, must be at least 25 years ago, when I was invited to speak at a conference on animal welfare in Taiwan. And I found when I got there that she was actually the founder and leader of the major organization that was putting together this conference. And I was impressed that a Buddhist monastic was doing this, because I suppose my image of Buddhists was that they spend a lot of time meditating and trying to get to enlightenment. But here was someone who was clearly very active in the world. So yes, we sort of, I was impressed with her at that time. But and then she was in contact with me to get animal liberation translated into what's called complex character Chinese. Not all of your listeners may know that Taiwan and a couple of other places, Hong Kong is one of them, still use the traditional Chinese characters, whereas the People's Republic of China simplified them many years ago. So they actually print separate books, translations of books, or their own books are printed in different Chinese characters. So although animal liberation was in Chinese, she wanted it in Taiwanese complex characters Chinese, and she organized that through her society. So there was some further contact. And then more recently, maybe 10 years ago, she invited me to another conference in Taiwan. And on this occasion, she took me and a couple of the other guests, including Tom Regan, the American philosopher, author of, unfortunately no longer with us, but author of the book, The Case for Animal Rights. She took us to another city in Taiwan, which was a couple of hours train ride away. And on that train journey, I had a lot of conversation with Chao-Hwei. We were sitting next to each other. Her English is not great, and for the book, actually, we went through a translator, but still, it was good enough to have some conversation. And I thought this is really interesting. You know, we really have some parallels, some closely related ideas on a number of issues. Animals is one of them. And we have some rather different views, and we come from very different starting points. So I thought it would be interesting to have some kind of a dialogue with her. And I suggested to her that we might do that. And she was enthusiastic about the idea. And she said, yes, you must come back to Taiwan sometime. We'll organize for you to stay 2 or 3 days in, she suggested, a meditation center in the mountains, which was an ideal setting. And we'll video the conversations we have. And then we can have that dialogue, and maybe we can publish them as a book. So we did that, and we did video the conversations. But although I thought it was really an interesting occasion, it still wasn't quite enough, I thought, for a book. We needed to go more deeply into some of these questions. So we did that then over email, and that took about another 5 years. So the book has been a long time in preparation. But I'm very pleased that it's happened. And in the meantime, incidentally, Chao-Hwei received a notable prize, the Niwano Peace Prize, a prize given by a Japanese organization for contributors to thought from different religious traditions or no religious tradition. So she has become better known, I'm pleased to say, in Taiwan and in Asia, but not yet in the West. And I hope this book will change that.
You really do go very in depth into the topics you're discussing, and it's a very nuanced discussion. And one thing I noticed, it's quite apparent that there's much more in common with the utilitarian philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy when it comes to ethics and morality. Were there any major points where you saw there was a very distinct difference in points of view?
Well, there are certainly differences in points of view. Some of them are ones that Chao-Hwei herself said are kind of optional for Buddhists to accept. So there's some discussion in the book about reincarnation and the Buddhist view that you come back as some other sentient being, and maybe if you do bad things, you might come back as an inferior non-human animal. That's struck me as a strange view. I can't see any evidence for that, really. But when I talked to Chao-Hwei about that kind of question, her view was really, well, she acknowledges there isn't really evidence for this. or not much evidence. She did talk a little bit about when people find searching for a particular new Lama, like the Dalai Lama, they bring possessions from the deceased Lama. They put them on a tray with other possessions with other items that were not belonging to the deceased Lama, and then the child, because it's a small child that they're talking about, reaches out and picks things from the tray, and so they see it as evidence if the child is able to pick the things that belong to the deceased Lama, that child is in some sense a reincarnation or continuation of that Lama. But she wasn't saying that this is conclusive evidence or that it's really conducted in a scientific way, and she was really saying, look, these are things that you can believe if you want to, but you don't have to believe them. So that meant that there was less disagreement than there would have been if she said, no, this is a foundational belief that you have to believe, and it affects the ethics of how we ought to live. The other major difference, I suppose, that does come across in the dialogue is a difference about the seriousness of killing, because my views about animals are really based on avoiding suffering rather than not killing. I think there are circumstances in which it's justified to kill a non-human animal. Of course, sometimes it's justified to kill a human being as well. And Chao-Hwei is not an absolutist on that. She didn't say that that's never justified, but I think for her, the barrier to doing that is greater than it is for me. So there were differences. There's some stories she talks about euthanasia for a dog who became ill, where I think I would have carried that out sooner and not left it to the very end as she did.
Right. And some of those topics you just mentioned we'll get a little more into shortly. But first, just for our audience, I think most people have a basic grasp on what Buddhism is. Maybe some people don't have a grasp on what it is to be a utilitarian. Can you fill us in on that?
Sure. So utilitarianism is an ethical view that is associated with Jeremy Bentham, who developed it most explicitly at the end of the 18th and early 19th century. But you can find proto-utilitarians going back a long way, and arguably Buddha was one of them. So essentially the idea is that an action is right or wrong depending on its consequences. The right action is the one that will have the best consequences of whatever options are open to you. And if you choose something that will not have the best consequences, then that's not the right choice to make. So that makes utilitarianism one of a family of theories that philosophers call consequentialist theories. What makes utilitarianism distinctive among other consequentialist theories is that it says, at least in its classical form, the consequences that matter are the well-being of any sentient being, essentially. Any being who can have a well-being, who can, let's say, feel pain or experience pleasure, that's what matters. We want to do the most we can to maximize the well-being of sentient creatures, either those living now or those who will live in the future, if we can. Of course, given that there's a lot of uncertainty about our impact on the future, we might discount the future by that degree of uncertainty. But apart from that, it still matters. We shouldn't only be thinking of the present. We shouldn't only be thinking of our friends and fellow citizens. We should be thinking about all sentient beings.
It seems to me that view on the consequences of our actions and wanting to make the choices or perform actions that lead to the best consequences for the most, it's very similar to the idea of karma, in that karma is about as we sow, so we reap. It's a motivating factor in terms of making good choices for the benefit of ourselves and others. Does that relationship sound accurate?
Yeah, I mean, Chao-Hwei and I discussed the concept of karma. She certainly rejects the simplistic idea that karma is the bad consequence, or the consequences of your bad actions coming back to you. I started that conversation by saying that I'd seen a T-shirt that said, "Karma is when you don't replace the toilet roll in the bathroom, and then you're the next person to use the bathroom." And she just didn't really, think that has anything to do with the idea of karma as she saw it. It does have something to do with the fact that actions have consequences. She certainly says that, but and that it's possible that you will then reap some of those consequences, but not in the sense that it's always bound to happen. She acknowledges that people can do bad things, and at least in this life, they can still have very enjoyable lives. Obviously, we all know of people who've done that, who've enriched themselves by doing bad things, and they die without any punishment coming to them. And at that point, she does refer to the possibility of reincarnation, but as I said, she doesn't insist on it. So that's effectively acknowledging that karma is not a guarantee or an iron law that if you do bad things will happen to you. It's rather this idea of just everything that we do has some consequences, and that's certainly something that I can fully agree with.
Right. I'm wondering, I mean, Buddhism operates in this kind of broader framework around the idea of, realizing the essence of who we are, or being, or consciousness. Does utilitarianism have any framework like that, a point of view on what it means to be a human being, or the purpose of a human life?
No, not really. And that is a significant difference. You could say Buddhism is a more comprehensive philosophical outlook. Utilitarianism is only an ethical theory. When I say only an ethical theory, because it's really important to have an ethical theory that guides our lives, but it doesn't in itself take a view on the world as a whole. It clearly emphasizes consciousness, as I said, capacities to feeling pain or pleasure. That's important. But there have been utilitarians who've been Christians, for example. William Paley was a contemporary of Bentham's, who wrote a book that actually sold more copies at the time than anything that Bentham wrote. And he was essentially a utilitarian because he claimed that God wants his creatures to be happy and not to suffer. Whereas Bentham was not a religious person. John Stuart Mill, who's the next most famous of the 19th century utilitarians, was not a religious person either. So there are very different outlooks that can be combined with a utilitarian ethical view.
Right. Okay. So it can really bolster your religious belief system or any other perspective that you're coming from.
Yes, that's right. It can do that. And I think one might say that in today's world, utilitarians typically do have a secular outlook, because it seems like religions more often claim that moral rules are absolute and are never to be violated. So, for example, whereas a utilitarian might say that sometimes you're justified in killing an innocent person if that's the only way to prevent a larger number of innocent people being killed, many Christians, not all of them, will say no. It's an absolute rule that you must never kill an innocent person. So for that reason, I think utilitarianism has been more widely adopted by people who are not religious. But certainly, as I say, there have been Christians who are utilitarians, and including in more recent times as well. There was in the 60s, I think, there was a popular book called Situation Ethics, written by Joseph Fletcher, who was a Episcopalian Christian in the United States. And in fact, that situation ethics really is an argument for utilitarianism. It's saying in every situation, there are no absolute rules. In any given situation, you should look at the circumstances and see what will be the best thing to do. And when you look at his examples, the best thing to do is the thing that produces the best consequences. So, it can happen, but the tendency seems to have been going away from religious utilitarians.
I'm curious if utilitarianism has a methodology or a way for us to discern, like, how do we know that the choice we're making is what is the best for the most people? How do we cut through our cultural conditioning, maybe emotional wounding, all the sorts of things that might skew our perspectives to kind of find a more objective view on making right choices and taking right actions?
Yeah, all of that is difficult, and there's no simple answer to how we do that, and there's no particular method other than saying, I suppose, look for evidence about what the consequences of your actions are likely to be, and try to be as open-minded and impartial as you can in looking for that evidence. But clearly, we are going to have cultural biases, as you mentioned, and you see them pretty strongly in some of the, not surprisingly, in some of the 19th century utilitarians, including John Stuart Mill, who spent most of his life employed by the East India Company. In other words, the company that was effectively administering India as a British colony until the 1850s, after the Indian Mutiny, when the British government basically took it over. But Mill was imbued with that idea that the East India Company was doing a good job, and there are remarks in his works which certainly strike us as racist today. He talks about, more civilized nations, something like that, meaning essentially white nations. So yeah, utilitarians have no way of immunizing themselves against those kinds of prejudices, and we have to be as open to them as we can. And of course, we have to acknowledge uncertainties in the choices that we make, and think about whether what we think is probable might nevertheless not happen. And so doing something where the probability is you will do some good, but if it doesn't work out, the result could be a complete catastrophe. If that's a significant chance, even if less probable than that you will do something good, then you shouldn't do that action. So you have to weigh all of that. Yeah, utilitarians talk about expected value, which means the value minus or discounted by the odds against it happening. So you don't always do, as I was saying, what is most likely to do good. You weigh up how much good and discount that by the probabilities of you're not actually achieving it.
Okay, thank you. I just want to point our audience. I want to ask a question based on, I watched a YouTube video, which was your final lecture at Princeton, titled "My Years at Princeton, Some Reflections." And for people that want to learn more about Peter's work over the last 24, 25 years, that's a really good video to watch. You touch on that, on the state of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, particularly in the United States. I'm wondering if you can share a bit with our audience now what you think the state of affairs is in these areas.
Right. Yes, I certainly have become concerned about the fact that it's become more difficult to express ideas that are controversial, that maybe not seen as politically correct by some circles, and this is true. Both the left and the right have been trying to restrict ideas that they don't like, and sometimes the right in the United States has the legislative power to do this, because Republicans in southern states may pass laws that you can't do or say certain things, and you certainly, that schools have to comply with certain policies. But also, coming from the left, there have been campaigns against people who've expressed ideas that some people don't like. One of those incidents that I think led me to think that something has changed and perhaps something needs to be done to keep freedom of discussion open was a case of a young woman academic called Rebecca Tuville, who published an article which related to the fact that many people support the idea that if you want to change gender, all you have to do is declare that you are of the gender you prefer, maybe sign some sort of document, and then you are, a man can become a woman and a woman can become a man. And yet, in contrast, there was a case of a woman called Rachel Dolezal, who was working for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and identified as African American. But it was revealed that she was not, in fact, African American by ancestry, and she was essentially hounded out of her position. The same people who were defending the right of somebody who wants to change their gender to do so were essentially blasting her for pretending to be African American when she wasn't. So in this article, Tuval sort of points out the incongruity of it, and seems to be suggesting that, since we accept the right of people to change gender, why shouldn't we accept the right of people to change race? And that provoked a very hostile reaction from a lot of people. Several hundred academics signed a letter. It was published in a journal called Hypatia, which is an academic journal mostly on dealing with feminist issues. And they called for it to be retracted by the journal. And it actually wasn't, but I think for Tuval, it was a very distressing experience. She was an untenured assistant professor, and her career seemed to be in jeopardy because of that reaction. Actually, in the end, she has recovered from that and made a successful career. But that seemed to me to be a quite unjustified response. I mean, I thought it was an interesting article, and the proper response for people who don't like it was to show why they disagreed with the arguments. That's what we do in philosophy and in other disciplines as well. So that and a number of other incidents led me together with two other academics, Francesca Minerva, who's an Italian academic now teaching at the University of Milan, and Jeff McMahon, who's professor of moral philosophy at the University of Oxford, to found a new journal, the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which is a peer-reviewed journal. We send well, not all, but the papers we receive that seem to have some possibility of being suitable for publication. We send them out anonymously to referees, so we take off the author's name and identifying references. And if the reviewers think that they are of publishable quality, we publish them, no matter how controversial the ideas are. And also, if the author is worried about repercussions, as they well might be after some of these incidents, they can publish under a pseudonym. They don't have to put their own name to it. If later the atmosphere changes and they want to be acknowledged as the author of this article, we will do that. So the journal has published, I think, 5 issues now. So we have 2 issues a year. It's a free open access journal. You just go to journalofcontroversialideas.org and you can look at any of the articles. And I think we've succeeded in establishing a place for a number of articles that would not have been published otherwise. And in fact, some of those authors have told us that. They've been rejected by the normal, if you like, conventional journals in their field. And they're very pleased to have found a place where they can express their ideas.
And I believe the website is journalofcontroversialideas.org. Is that right?
That's correct. That's right. And we do, as I say, we're completely free. Of course, there are some costs, even with publishing only online. And we ask readers to make a donation. And so far, we've survived through the generosity of generally a large number of fairly small donors, which is nice.
Peter, do you think there is ever a place for censoring ideas?
Yes, I'm not an absolutist on that. Many years ago, there was a controversy when an American journal, I think it was called The Progressive, published a sketch of how to make a hydrogen bomb. I thought that was a very unwise thing to do. And if I had the power to stop that, I would have. I don't think anybody has used it to build a hydrogen bomb, fortunately. But now, in fact, it's easier to create very dangerous things. and there's been discussion in some of the sciences about publication of how to engineer viruses to make them either to make them more contagious or to make them more deadly, or obviously what's very serious, a combination of those two. I think it's good that scientists should be aware of that, and I think, if the voluntary moratorium doesn't work, then I think it would be good for governments to step in. So those are some very practical cases. Are there other cases? Well, I think where there is incitement to violence, that's justified by, you can justify censorship. Where there is vilification, here, I'm speaking to you from Australia, and we have laws against vilification on racial grounds or other ethnic or I think sexual orientation as well. And I would see the difference between vilification and the kind of things that I've been talking about in terms of vilification is an attempt to stir up emotions, negative emotions about a particular group of people. And I think that where that group of people is in danger and there is a risk that they are going to be harmed, physically attacked, not just harmed by the words, but physically attacked, then I think censorship is justified. But if somebody is wanting to express a doctrine that some people find offensive, but they are arguing for it, they are providing reasons or evidence as to why their view is true, then I don't think, I can't really think of cases where I would accept censorship. I think, as I was saying before, the best response to somebody who's trying to argue for a belief that you believe is false and possibly dangerous is to argue against it and show why it's flawed. But otherwise, I think it's good for societies to be able to disagree and to argue about controversial ideas, because I think that's the way to find out the truth. And if we censor ideas, we may be living with falsehoods that we accept that never get challenged and therefore just remain in place.
Right. I just want to take a moment to remind our live audience that we'll be getting to some of your questions in a little bit. So go ahead and type those into the comments field on YouTube, and we'll tend to as many of those as we can. Peter, you've experienced some attacks on your ideas and controversy over the years in your academic career. And first off, I want to acknowledge that I don't by any means know your full point of view on this subject. So I'm really inquiring out of curiosity and hoping we can have a nuanced dialogue about it. So there's a chapter in the book on euthanasia and suicide. And in my research, I discovered that you had come under fire at some time around some of your views on the possibility of euthanizing a newborn child with a very extreme disability. I'm just wondering if you can sort of clarify what your point of view was on that.
Right. So I came to discuss this issue because when I was in Australia in the 1980s, I founded a Centre for Bioethics at Monash University, the university where I was teaching, which is a major university in Melbourne. And sometime after we founded this Centre for Bioethics, we were contacted by the director of a neonatal intensive care unit, in other words, intensive care unit that deals with newborn babies who have problems, who asked if he and a couple of other people working in that unit could come and talk to us about some of the decisions they had to make about severely disabled newborns. And what we learned from that conversation was that there are conditions where the doctors thought that it was better that the child should not live. And they would consult with the parents, and the parents, understanding the prognosis for their child, would also agree that it would be better that the child not live. And what the doctors were doing in those circumstances was essentially not treating the child in various ways, made it highly probable, not absolutely certain, that the child would die fairly soon, but not immediately. So One of these conditions is a condition called spina bifida, which was then much more common than it is now, because women who are pregnant or intending to get pregnant are usually told by their doctors to take folic acid, and it's been discovered that folic acid greatly reduces the chances of having a baby with this condition. But in babies born with spina bifida have an open wound in their back where the spinal cord is. And they're going to have a variety of different disabilities depending on the nature of the wound and where it is and so on. So in the more severe cases, the doctors in this intensive care unit were simply not closing the wound. They were not performing surgery to close the wound. And they were not, and the result of having an open wound is very likely to be that the baby gets an infection. And then when the baby got an infection, they would not administer antibiotics because that would clear up the infection. And what they were wanting was that the infection would get worse and the baby would die. And that mostly happened. So, that seemed to me to be, and my colleague, I should say, I was working with Helga Kuser, who was a colleague at the Bioethics Center there. It seemed to both of us that this was not the best possible outcome. It wasn't that we were challenging the decision that sometimes a baby's condition may be so bad that it's better that the baby should die, but it's rather that the idea of bringing about the baby's death through non-treatment was not the best way of responding, because sometimes for one thing, sometimes the baby would still live, and other times the death would be quite slow and quite drawn out, even to months. And this was not only a lot of suffering for the baby, but also, of course, for the parents who would come in and visit their sick child who was not being treated, and they knew that the child was not being treated. And it was a strain for the nurses whose job it was to look after these babies. And of course, their whole instinct is to try to treat and help babies, but they were told they couldn't do that in these cases. So our proposal was that in these circumstances, if the parents and doctors agree that it's better for the infant not to live, they should be allowed to actively accelerate the child's death, to give the child a drug that means the child dies peacefully. And I should say I'm also, and have been for a long time, an advocate of competent adults having the choice to have that decision. And fortunately, here in Australia and also where I am, and also in Canada where you are, those rights have now been recognised in law by legislation in Australia, or at least in all of the separate legislation in all the states of Australia, and by the Supreme Court in Canada. But in the case of newborn infants who can't, of course, make a decision themselves, then just giving that right to competent adults doesn't help. And I think the only country that actually openly allows active euthanasia for newborn infants with the consent of the doctors and parents is the Netherlands. So in that sense, although things have changed in the general area of euthanasia quite a lot since the 1980s when I first started writing about this issue, they haven't changed very much with regard to infants. They've changed only with regard to competent adults.
Thanks for clarifying that. So it's not like, because it seems like the people that were sort of condemning what you were saying, they made it sound as if you were out there advocating for the euthanasia of disabled children, rather than it being in this very specific context where you were brought in to help with a very difficult ethical decision in a very specific circumstance.
That's correct. Yes, I think my position is often distorted. I do think that a lot depends on the parents and their wishes. I think that's very important. And even there's some cases, there were a couple of cases in Britain. There's a case of a baby called Charlie Gard, where the court said that the parents could not take the child. The hospital said this child's condition is hopeless and we're not going to treat the child because it's kinder not to. And there was an American doctor who said, maybe I can help the child. He wasn't saying he could necessarily. And the parents wanted to remove the child and take him to America where he could be treated. And the hospital said, no, he can't be treated and that will be cruel to the child. And the court sided with the hospital. I would have sided with the parents in that case, because I would have thought the child could be sufficiently tranquilized not to suffer too much during the travel, and maybe the child would survive. Very, very probably it wouldn't. So yeah, my position is really to give a lot of weight to the wishes of the parents, at least where they seem to be fairly reasonable. And it's certainly not that I'm saying that, we should not have any disabled kids. If the parents want to have their disabled child, of course, they should have it. And in fact, the state should support them as much as possible to give that child the best possible life.
What's your view on maybe we could call it the intrinsic gifts of someone living with a lot of suffering? Could be an extreme disability. It could be any other sort of major challenges that someone experiences that might look to someone on the outside to be a terrible curse. Do you ever see that I know in Buddhism they talk, and in many spiritual traditions, they'll talk about suffering as a gateway to sort of profound shifts in consciousness. Is this something that you ever consider in your views on different issues?
Yes, I do think about that, and certainly suffering. A lot of people, not Buddhists, but people here say suffering is character building. I went through this tough experience, but I emerged better for it. So I'm not denying the instrumental benefits of suffering, that it can be useful in this way. But I do think there are limits to that. And I think they're choices that people ought to be able to make. Certainly when people are terminally ill and are not expected to live very long anyway, but they're suffering, I think to say to them, well, suffering will be character building for you. And they say, but I may never emerge from this suffering. And even if I do, it's likely to be for a very short time. I think that's a choice that they can make, to say, no, I don't want to suffer. Thank you. But if people do accept suffering, and to some extent, I suppose athletes do that all the time. I think for a lot of people, running a marathon isn't a very pleasurable experience, but nevertheless, they want to do it and they feel rewarded by the fact that they've achieved it. Mostly those are choices that people would make. But if you have an infant who is not capable of making that choice, and maybe will never be capable of reflecting on whether that was the right choice or not because of brain damage that they have, and I don't think we think of suffering as good in those cases.
It seems that the lack of nuance in public dialogue is such a boon, or not a boon, such a challenge these days. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas on how we can address the public forum, social media, for instance, where we're operating in these silos and people are just having their own ideas reinforced. And it seems like people are just shouting at each other. How can we try and create the conditions for engaging in a nuanced and open-minded way?
All that I can do there is to show that it's possible, and hope that other people will see that it's possible and will move towards it. And that's exactly what I've been trying to do in the classes that I've been teaching at Princeton. So you mentioned the last lecture of one of those classes, but in many of the other classes of that semester, I would bring people into the room who had very different ideas. For example, I had a class in which the two speakers were Frances Kissling, who founded a group called Catholics for Free Choice on abortion that she's talking about, and has had more than 30 years in the reproductive rights community in the United States, and a woman called Teresa Bukonovac, who is from a pro-life group and who showed pictures of dismembered fetuses that her group had obtained from a hospital, and was very strong in saying that the fetus or the unborn child has the same rights to life as you or me. But interestingly, they could have a civil discussion about it, and the class appreciated that and asked them both questions. And And I've done that in several of the classes to try to bring people together, or to sometimes bring people who are opposed to my views on those issues. And I think students appreciate it. The classes have all been civil. I can't remember a single, hostile, abusive outburst. Certainly not during the class. I don't know what students said to each other after the class, but yeah. So that kind of dialogue is possible. Philosophers do it all the time. Some people who are not familiar with the way philosophy works are surprised by how strongly we criticize each other. I remember at one seminar where I had a disagreement with another philosopher, and somebody who was not in philosophy but had attended the seminar said, "I don't know how you can be in the same department with that person. That must be terribly painful to pass him in the corridor," or something like that. And I said, "Not at all. We're friends. We go to the pub and have a drink together." That's just that's not a thing that we allow to harm our personal relationships. We respect people's different opinions, even though we continue to disagree with them.
Thank you. We've got some audience questions coming in here, Peter. Is it okay if we tend to some of those?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. There's a question here from Rena, who says, what do you think can be done about the corporate capture and governmental interference with mainstream media in the West? Thank you.
Yes. Well, corporate capture has been going on for a long time. And as an Australian, I was familiar with the Murdoch press even before Rupert Murdoch moved to the United States and set up Fox News and took over various other newspapers. So it's not a new thing. I'm not sure what we can do about it. Again, we need to have some way of trying to mark things that are true and things that are not true as far as we can. We need to have independent, respected verifiers, you might call them, or falsifiers. But social media provides some kind of answer because it provides forums which are not ruled by the corporate culture. But then you mentioned the idea of being in silos a moment ago. Then you get people just following their own particular little group of people, and there is still a commercial emphasis that makes that worse, because the websites want to sell advertising, and so their algorithms will promote materials that people are more likely to click on. And if you have data about a person and you know what that person is likely to click on, then the algorithms feed the person more of that kind of data. And people seem to have more tendency to click on things that agree with their outlook than that disagree with it. So it's still a problem. And I suppose, Rena, I'm really saying, yes, what you're talking about is a problem at various levels. And I don't know the solution, but it's good that we're aware of it, and maybe some people will come up with ways of at least mitigating the effect, even if we don't ever quite overcome it.
I just want to say, Peter, it strikes me that you are very much okay with not having all the answers, which is very refreshing. And it seems to be lacking in a lot of people that have as big of a voice as you do in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be honest and not try and bluff your way through things that you don't really know enough about. It's best sometimes to say, I don't know what to do about this problem. Maybe some of these people, some of you out there, have better answers than I do.
Yeah. There's a question from Sabina, who says, "Hi, Peter. How would Assange, Navalny, Snowden, and others argue in favor of whistleblowing and risking their lives for the sake of general welfare benefits in the future? Thank you."
Well, I mean, there's a variety of people there. Some extremely brave people who've done heroic things. I think it's we were talking with the Journal of Controversial Ideas about the importance of ideas being out there so that people can assess them and work out what's sound and what isn't, what's true and what's false. And obviously, to work out what's true and what's false in a lot of areas, you need information. And if the information is not there, if the information is held secretly, then maybe it will take a whistleblower to get it out there. And we've made some progress. For the Freedom of Information Acts that we have in many countries, which work to varying degrees, I think do help us to get information out there, but not always. And those whistleblowers that Sabina mentioned have helped to get information out there in important ways. And of course, some of them have suffered greatly for it. Navalny ended up suffering, paying with his life, and many years in imprisonment for campaigning. Originally, he started, of course, as a campaigner against corruption in Russia. Yes, the others, Snowden and Assange, somewhat similar things that they've done to get information out.
Linda is asking, is there a perspective or position you held deeply that you changed after a dialogue with someone who challenged your perspective with alternative views?
Well, there's certainly positions that I held deeply that I've changed. One of them, perhaps the deepest one of those, is that I used to think that there was actually no possibility of making objectively true moral judgments. I used to think that moral judgments are always subjective, in the sense that ultimately different people will have different inclinations, different feelings, different desires about what they favor or don't favor, and their moral judgments will be grounded on that. And I held that view for quite a long time. I suppose probably started holding it at some stage when I was an undergraduate, and continue to hold it until, really until when I came to Princeton. I still held it. I was sort of struggling with it. I wouldn't say I actually held it, but I certainly didn't disavow it. And I came to Princeton in 1999. It was only after that I started really thinking, well, my attempts to reconcile different things that I hold really don't work because of this view. And I was influenced by some other philosophers. It wasn't one single dialogue. Derek Parfit was a great philosopher who died 4 or 5 years ago, who started arguing for objectivity in ethics. Thomas Nagel is an American philosopher who has been arguing for that, and I did have some discussions with him, as well as reading things that he's read on that. Things that he's written. So I changed my mind on that after quite a long time, and it's quite a profound change on what I think about ethics.
Thanks, Linda, for that question. There's another one here from Joseph, who starts with a compliment, which leads to a question. He says, "Thank you for your time, Professor Singer. You're one of the leading and most respected utilitarian philosophers, perhaps of all time. Why do you choose utilitarianism over virtue ethics?"
It's a nice compliment, but as compared to Bentham and John Stuart Mill and the less well-known philosopher Henry Sidgwick, who's, I think, perhaps as a philosopher, the best of those three, I don't think I compare with them at all. But why do I choose utilitarianism over virtue ethics? Well, firstly, utilitarianism has the great advantage of essentially telling you how you ought to act, provided you are in possession of the relevant facts about the consequences, or what the consequences of your actions are most likely to be. Virtue ethics doesn't do that. It has a kind of a vagueness in it, because it says, essentially, it's saying you should act as a virtuous person would act in these circumstances. But what is a virtuous person? Well, there are a variety of different virtues that people have that were listed. It goes back to Aristotle and so on, but we don't necessarily want to entirely agree with Aristotle and his list of virtues. So we can debate which virtues one ought to have, but then, more difficult still, there will be virtues that will clash with each other. So, for example, veracity or honesty is generally considered a virtue, telling the truth, in other words. But benevolence or compassion, wanting to do good, wanting to reduce suffering, is also a virtue. And those are obviously going to clash. famously, for example, Immanuel Kant wrote a little essay about what you should do if there is somebody who somebody else is trying to kill, and the intended victim comes to your door and says, "Can I hide in your house because so-and-so is trying to kill me?" And then you say, "Sure, go ahead and hide." And then a few minutes later, the would-be murderer comes to your door and says, "Have you seen so-and-so?" Well, I think you were to lie. Every utilitarian would say you were to lie. You were to say, "Yes, I saw so-and-so. They were running that way," or something like that. Or maybe say, "No, I haven't seen so-and-so at all." But Kant said, no, it's not exactly a virtue ethicist. I guess he was just an absolute rule ethicist here. But you could imagine a virtue ethicist saying that, or at least a virtue ethicist might say, "I don't know how you balance these two virtues in those circumstances." And that doesn't seem to me to be a satisfactory answer. So obviously there would be more to be said, but in the time we have available, that's, I think, as much of an answer as I can give.
That's great. Thank you. We have, I think, time for one more audience question. And actually, Rena has another question, which is, are you involved with or have you written about the ethics of transhumanism and AI?
Well, I am somewhat involved with those issues. I haven't written extensively about it. Transhumanism, depending on exactly what you mean by that. I write a monthly opinion piece for something called Project Syndicate. You can find them online at projectsyndicate.org, but there is a paywall there. And I did write something about people who were inserting little digital devices into their bodies, and touched a little bit on transhumanism there. But I haven't written very much about that. My view essentially is that I don't think, and this does cohere with other things that I've written about animals, for example, I don't think actually being human in the sense of being a member of the species Homo sapien is itself morally important. I think what's morally important is the consciousness we have, the awareness we have, the various abilities that we have. So, if you would download your consciousness to a digital device, and that digital device could think and talk and feel and act as you do, with the great advantage maybe that it wasn't going to age and suffer from diseases, you would then no longer be human. But I think that would be fine if you could do that without any problems and without any drawbacks. Obviously, there might be some drawbacks. So in that sense, transhumanism, I don't really object to. Sorry, there was something else in Rena's question as well as transhumanism.
AI.
Oh yeah, AI. Well, I have written a bit about AI and ethics, mostly actually about AI's impact on animals, and the fact that most of the principles of AI ethics and most of the courses teaching AI ethics, the impact of AI on animals doesn't get mentioned. So together with a Hong Kong colleague called Tsai Yip-Fai, we've published a couple of, and some articles with some German colleagues. We've published articles in a journal called AI and Ethics about those questions. But obviously, there are a lot of other questions about the ethics of AI which are important, and which I do think about, but haven't really addressed very much as yet.
Thanks to our live audience for all the great questions, and of course for being a part of these live streaming events. Of course, we've been talking to Peter Singer about his newest book, The Buddhist and the Ethicist, Conversations on Effective Altruism, Engaged Buddhism, and How to Build a Better World. And of course, he co-authored that. It was a dialogue between him and Shih Chao-Hwei. Peter, it's been really wonderful to have you with us, and we're really honored that you took the time. I thought maybe a question that we could part on. I wanted to ask you, at this stage of your life and work, you've spent so many years contemplating and exchanging ideas. What do you think are the most powerful ways that everyday people like us here today can contribute to making the world a more safe and just place for all beings? What are sort of the fundamentals of that?
Well, there are two things that I emphasize in terms of changes that people can make in their lives. And they correspond to things that I've written books about and been active on. One of them is to think about the effect of what you eat, because those choices have a lot of implications. I started out particularly being concerned about the suffering we inflict on animals, especially factory farmed animals. And I still think that that's just a vast area of suffering, of worldwide, maybe 200 billion sentient beings, and that's vertebrate animals only. If sentient invertebrates would be even larger, possibly. So it's a vast universe of suffering that we contribute to, especially, as I say, if we eat factory farmed animals, as most of the meat and eggs sold in affluent countries are. But it also has a big impact on climate change and on environmental pollution and lots of other impacts. So that's one. And the other thing is, I think, to think about how you can assist people in extreme poverty. I co-founded an organization called The Life You Can Save. And if you go to the website of The Life You Can Save, you can download free a digital or audio copy of my book with the same title, The Life You Can Save. And you can also look at the organization's list of independently assessed organizations which are highly effective in helping people in extreme poverty. And I think if we're fortunate enough to be living in an affluent society and not right down at the bottom of that affluent society, then I think we ought to be doing something to help people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world.
That's really great. Thank you, Peter. And of course, people can find all of these links to The Life You Can Save and the Journal of Controversial Ideas at your personal website, which is petersinger.info, correct?
That's correct. Yes. Thank you.
Any parting thoughts for us, Peter? Anything you want to share about what's coming next for you?
What's coming next for me is I have a very small book called Consider the Turkey coming out before Thanksgiving. It will tell people how turkeys are produced, how they live, and I hope you won't be ordering turkey for Thanksgiving. After you read it, or maybe better, as it's only coming out in October, don't make any advance orders until you get the chance to read it, and hopefully you'll then eat something else for Thanksgiving.
Peter, thank you so much for being here. Really a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Ross. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.